that I think are super helpful. I'm going to try to share my screen successfully and hope that that works. And okay, are we good, Becca? Can you see that okay? Okay. Let's see. I want to make sure that we're all good. Okay, Becca, can you see that? I am not able to see at the same time. Are we good?
So I can't see just the presentation. I can see some other stuff too.
Okay, tell me if you can see this now, like that's all.
Yes, I can see just your presentation.
Okay, good. Okay, because that's all I can see too, so I can't see hand gestures or anything like that, and want to make sure it's all working.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. All right, so this lesson plan that kind of goes into more depth will be also available on the OCAGE website for those of you who are signed up to be members of that and can access resources there. And my focus is just to help us look at things that we can do with our students to help them process what they have learned about the massacre through literacy and through discussion as well. So along the way, like I said, if you've got any things that you have questions about, feel free to put those in the chat. There are several standards for both the national geography standards and what we have here in the Oklahoma academic standards, both for ELA and for social studies, that are applicable through any of these activities. And I want to start out with this quote from one of the curators at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. I spent time there last fall, and they have an amazing exhibit on the powerful significance of place, and in that the Tulsa Race Massacre has a dedicated space, and they've done such a great job with that. This quote, it's the power of certain places, about displacement, movement, about what place means for people. This is about emotion and culture and memory. How do you tell a story about destruction? How do you balance the fortitude and resilience of people in response to that devastation? How do you fill the silences? How do you address the silences about a story that this community has held in silence for so long and in denial for so long? And I think that really is a great segue, both from Professor Lansana's mention of Black excellence, Black resilience in this matter, but also in how silence has played a role in so long. All over our state, I hear people all the time talk about how this was not addressed in school when they were a student, how it wasn't until adulthood, maybe a college course, or now what they're seeing on the news as we are searching for mass graves, that it wasn't until recently that they even knew about this event. And silence has played a big role in that. As we come upon the centennial, it's more important than ever as educators that we address head on things that are uncomfortable. And I hope that whatever grade level that you teach, that maybe you'll come away with something today that you feel more confident in sharing with your students and in the classroom, and hopefully give you some tools to do that across different grade levels. So before we go into any of that, just looking at the ways that we can foster discussion about sensitive subjects in our classrooms. We owe it to our students to not shy away from even the most tragic parts of history. Social studies especially is ultimately about the study of relationship. Humans with environment, humans with one another, and how society functions. So more than ever, and I would argue maybe more than any other subject area, it really comes down to us as social studies educators to help our students learn how to do this meaningfully in the classroom, but also to prepare them to do that meaningfully throughout their lives. So just a few tips that I have also linked the resource in to establish a safe space for students with ground rules. Maybe brainstorm with your students, especially older ones, maybe upper elementary, middle up on into high school. Brainstorm with them what they believe a sensitive, supportive classroom should look like. when we address certain topics or certain portions of history. And much like when we teach about September 11th and the Oklahoma City bombing, I always remind my students then to really stop and think about, if they had lost a loved one in either of those events, how they would want other students like them to behave during learning about those things, how they would want others to absorb that information respectfully, of course, in an honorable way is what they would want. And so just generating that conversation with your students. It's also really important to acknowledge our own biases as educators, and to not be afraid to acknowledge those with our students, and let them know that we acknowledge we don't have all the answers and that we're still learning and working through things too. And then, of course, knowing your students' relationship is so key to what we do all the time, but here in this instance more than ever. Keep in mind the traumas of your students, but also the biases of your students too. If your student body is a little bit more homogenous or affluent, just emphasize with them throughout discussion personal responsibility and how being silent is equal to being complicit, and things like this. Respect and recognize the diversity of your own classroom, provide space for different perspectives, also helping your students to be focused with whatever the objective or the framework is at hand. And if things get a little off task, bringing them back to that. Of course, fostering stability. Be prepared to deal with emotional moments, the more detail that you might go into depending on your grade level. And what this will be the focus on, my time with you, is providing time for meaningful reflection with your students through writing exercises and ways for them to really express what they've absorbed and how that makes them feel and the things that they have learned. And I would say at the elementary level, to focus on empathy, citizenship, the value of diversity, the dangers of prejudice in our society. As you maybe teach middle school on up into high school, then I think students begin to be able to grasp the complexity of historical events like this in their proper context. And of course, you can go into a little bit more deeper discussion. But as I said, with children's books that are coming out, I think that's going to help it be a lot more accessible and make elementary teachers like myself feel even more comfortable approaching this with students. Place is one of the 5 themes of geography. And so I, no matter the grade level, would encourage you to think about these questions yourself, and maybe pose those to your students too as you are introducing the topic of the Tulsa Race Massacre, asking students what is a place that is meaningful to you? What makes that powerful? If you feel comfortable right now opening up the chat box and sharing your thoughts on this, I would love to see those. Think for a moment. Where is a place for you that is meaningful, and what makes that location so powerful to you? Are there any places that you carry with you? Places that you have had to leave behind before? Depending on the students that you have in your classroom, you will have those who have had to immigrate from another place, and maybe they remember that, maybe they don't, but maybe for their family, that place that they have had to leave is still very important to them, very much a part of that. You'll have other students who have moved for different reasons, but this is something that as you start out and kind of hook your audience with the significance of place, Greenwood in particular, of course, is what we're talking about, and will be very important to circle back to, and how home is very hard to leave behind, and how the attachment to that is something that is universal for all of us, no matter what age that we are. I would also say that as is stated in our standards, it is really important that we help students start to be thinking about the differences between riot and massacre. As educators who now know more about this topic, maybe in adulthood, we know that for a long time, there was a mislabel on this event for specific reasons. And it's important that we help students start to think through the differences between those two labels, and again, eventually circle back into what is the most appropriate title for what happened here. So having students think through those two things and write down what they think are the differences between the two, making the connection even to what's going on now in our society and how things continue to be labeled differently depending on agenda and audience, I think would be really good for students to make that connection from past to present. And of course, there will be some applicable vocabulary that you might need to introduce or reinforce with your students, such as segregation and racism. And then prosperity, what an entrepreneur is, what reconciliation ultimately looks like. Those are things that I think would be very useful in helping your students either be introduced to or expand upon, depending on where your students are at before you jump into some of these reading and writing exercises. So focusing on Black excellence, I think that having for your students time to explore historic Greenwood and to have them look at the success of that area, the flourishing of businesses there, using primary and secondary sources to look at those things, focusing again on the prosperity of that area, but then also how that relates to the causes of the massacre too. Very important to help students clarify the differences between what underlying causes of historic events like this are and what the immediate causes are. So those rising tensions of jealousy and Black wealth, the fear of losing jobs, Black World War I veterans returning to their nation with this new resolve to combat segregation, and also a reinvigorated KKK presence in the area. So looking at all of those things historically, having students research. In the lesson plan, I provided some great resources, especially from Black-owned publications that are really, really great for helping students see, as the professor stated, all of the amazing businesses and professions that were in the area, their prosperity during this time. But again, also how that jealousy of Black wealth really escalated and things kind of built on one another until that day, that catalyst moment in the elevator. So looking at some primary sources, in the end of my slides, I've linked some amazing resources from the Tulsa Historical Society, the Oklahoma Historical Society, and the Tulsa World, really helping your students take a look at actual newspaper headlines from that day, the official Red Cross report, and then an amazing collection of photographs from the massacre, just some activities that I would suggest that you do as students, having them create a timeline, look at a timeline or create one based on some research, maybe some different resources that I linked that you could use to have students piece those things together. And depending on the technology that your district has available, there are things that you can use that I've included where you could send your students on a web quest for these things, or you can have those things pre-printed, ready for your students if your district is like mine and technology is not something that students have one-to-one. But having students, now that they've looked at the prosperity of the Greenwood district, and now that they have also looked at all of those rising tensions that had happened in the area, looking now, okay, now that the spark was lit, what are the events that happened in succession? So creating a timeline, looking at that, and also having your students look through those photos from the archives. One strategy that I like to use with students is a see, think, wonder where they write down what they notice about the photo, observations that they have about what's going on, and then questions that they have about the image. That would even be a great hook exercise to do with students too at the very beginning. There are some resources included in the lesson plan for you to introduce the topic to students as well, with a video, things like this. But as far as focusing on some writing exercises to do with them, these are some things that I would highly suggest to help students explore the topic after that introduction to them. Another thing that I think would be really useful for students to do is to examine some of the front page headlines of the time. Challenge them to detect some misleading or incomplete headlines of those primary sources, and really look with students at how past and present loaded language plays a huge role in how we interpret events. Maybe work through, older students especially, work through with them why word choice is so calculated, and the reasons why things are referred to differently depending on the publication and depending on the audience. That is as timely of a discussion as anything. And then have students maybe create their own front page headline and stories, piecing together what they have learned about the events of May 31st to June 1st of 1921. And then also looking at some sources like the Red Cross official report. They were what I know to be the only outside organization that came in to help, not to agitate, but to help, and were limited at first at what they could do. So having students look at that report, and then also imagine that they are a Red Cross worker or a volunteer, and to write a journal entry of what they see and experience, and challenges that they face in the community during that time of trying to assist. And again, older students could consult the pretty lengthy report more in depth as part of their investigation, using those texts just as a way for them to get more exposure to primary sources. That's something, of course, in social studies, it's very important for us to use, and helping them understand that the historic events that they are experiencing in their lives right now, their journal entries, their pictures, their experiences will one day become the primary sources that future students study. Helping them make that connection during this time that we're living in, I think, is a huge eye-opener for them. They don't often see themselves as players in history in the making, but with the pandemic, of course, and the things that are going on in the society around us, I think we are in a unique position to help them understand the time that they are living in, and how momentous it is, and what they can do for students like themselves in the future to have something to reflect back on. All right, and then I also wanted in my suggested lessons, I mean, these are all things that you can pick and choose from, of course, depending on your audience and the time that you have, but it's important to utilize some pretty powerful voices that we have in regard to the massacre too. Poetry, looking at different poems that are both a primary source from someone who lived through. And then also Professor Lansna has a great poem too called Recipe for a Massacre, Tulsa 1921. I have linked to 2 different poems that you can have students compare and look through, and again, as a springboard to really discuss how being silent in the face of injustice is being complicit. And I think connecting, especially for older students, middle school and above, really starting to connect for them the role that they play in their corner of the world is going to be one of your most powerful tools in a lesson like this, helping them to understand that they play a very important role in society and helping them to understand that inaction is a choice, and how the events of our past all came down to choices being made and those looking the other way. And this is another example of that too. But also using the voices of survivors. I have linked some audio, also some video interviews. Dr. Olivia Hooker gives a great interview that the Oklahoma Historical Society has recorded and made available, and also just from some statements too. Have students really discuss and define for them what being a survivor means. Have students share, after looking through those accounts, what has struck them the most, and maybe even identify reasons why those survivors may have been motivated to stay in the area after the massacre to rebuild the Greenwood District, but also identify reasons why others chose to relocate. Again, bringing it back to the themes of movement in place, and why we don't just leave home unless something prompts us to. And then Reconciliation Park. This is something that we can explore virtually with our students. I want to see if I can take this link there and see if it will go. Virtual field trips are going to be our norm for quite some time, whether your district is having school virtually in a hybrid setting, or if you're in person. We're just so limited in what we can do right now. So a culminating activity with your students, I really strongly suggest looking at the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation. They have great resources at their website, and then the Reconciliation Park that we have in Tulsa. Have students explore this area and also dig really deep into the symbolism that is in each portion of this memorial. I would suggest having students compare this with the Oklahoma City National Memorial. Many students have hopefully been there, but you can also take them there virtually too through the memorial's website. Have them look at both parks and identify the symbolism there, how both sites honor victims and survivors. What is there at both sites that reminds us to remember how impactful violence can be, and how important peace and tolerance are in the wake of these events. For your older students, have them dig deep and discuss or write about why they think it took so much longer for us to have these sites to honor the massacre, when after the bombing, that was something that we got started on very quickly. Looking at the symbols that are there to commemorate each tragedy, but also what in each memorial site does to look to the future and look forward, and to look at the revival of both areas, both in Oklahoma City and here in Tulsa. And then if you can see with my cursor, I'm going to circle around this particular part. The three sides of this piece, with their statues that take their inspiration from photographs of people during these 2 days of hell, are labeled with the themes of humiliation, hostility, and hope. I would really have older students unpack each of those themes and the symbols that were carefully chosen to embody each of those things on this piece of the memorial. I think that is something very thought-provoking, and would be such a fruitful discussion for your classes to share with each other. I'm just amazed at how much thought goes into building any memorial, looking at the symbolism that can be used. It's super, super impressive. This is no exception. All right, so Some writing exercises are the focus of my presentation. And so I would love for you to go into the chat box and respond to at least one, maybe more of these prompts if you are open and willing. Please number your response to match up with the prompt, just for ease of clarity. I'm going to show them to you one by one, and then I will have a slide that has all 5 together to help you kind of look through and choose and be reminded of those prompts a little bit more easily. These are things that I would have students do. My background is with upper elementary and middle school. And so these are things that I think many of them could be utilized with students of that age group, but some of them might be reserved for more older students. I would also provide these in my classroom as probably a choice board, giving students some different options that they could have with what they wanted to respond to. Okay, so the first one would be to explain why massacre is a more fitting label for these events than riot. The professor reminded us why that was such a deliberate choice for all these years to label it that way. But I think it's important for students to understand why we are correctly identifying it as a massacre today. And the second one, can this be considered an act of terrorism against the city's African American community? Support your answer with evidence. Now, this part I didn't share explicitly, but with older students, if I taught Oklahoma history, I would absolutely be having my students dig into the reports of planes flying overhead and dropping accelerants and things like that onto Greenwood. And just the fact that so many people were armed and deputized and things like that, I would have my older students really examine how those things could be considered a terroristic act. Number 3, what do you think would have happened if the technologies of today were present during this time? So things like TV, internet, social media, would that have amplified and worsened things? Would we, on the flip side of that, though, have more access to know the truth about those events? And would it have taken so long, maybe, to learn about these things? Just some things to think about and ponder upon. The next one, compare and contrast the racial tensions during the years leading up to the Tulsa Race Massacre and to those that exist today in the US. Reflect on regional and state level differences in race relations in the present day USA. What do you notice? Again, older students who are watching the news and have much more exposure to what's going on will have a lot to say, I think, about this. And again, it can be daunting as an educator to foster these discussions. I get that. When I teach about 9/11 or the bombing, those are things that I was alive for. I have much more experience with. My family has deep connection to. So it's not, those aren't topics that I am hesitant to teach about. But I think for other topics that are so far back in history and are just huge blemishes on our nation, are very intimidating for educators. We cannot let our fear get in the way of sharing truth. So I hope that you do feel empowered, that you can share truth with students and give them a chance to be thoughtful about things and to share their feelings and help them start to see these connections being made. And as long as you are fostering in a classroom of support and making it a safe place, I think you're going to be really surprised at how maturely your students handle this subject matter. And then from one of the pieces of literature that I'm going to touch on in just a little bit, there's a quote from the novel Dreamland Burning that I think is really incredible and very thought-provoking and would lead to a lot of great discussion or written reflection from your students. The dead always have stories to tell. They just need the living to listen. Helping your students see that connection with the silence of all these years, and how coming out of that and helping others to know what happened in the massacre is so important. So if you'll take a moment, I will put these 5 back up. And if you in the chat box will put the number of the prompt that you are responding to. Some of them are a little bit more complex and I know would take a lot more time. So I know that there will be some that may not be as responded to, but I would love to see maybe what you all would have to say. And hopefully these are some that you could practice with your students. I am going to try to minimize this so I can see your responses too without hopefully taking away this completely. I'm going to see what I can do to maybe see that a little bit better. I don't want to take it away, but I think I did, didn't I? Can I move that over? Okay. Becca, will you just share maybe out loud with me so I can still share this? I don't want to take it away, but maybe that way I can also hear what's going on in the chat box. Is that okay?
Sure. So you just want me to read what people are saying in the chat?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So number 1, the label of riot is indicative of provocation and somehow deserved punishment, whereas a massacre, clearly more accurate, indicates the rising up of one group against another without provocation and being obliterated unjustly. Number 3, protests and marches across the country.
Mm-hmm.
Number 1, it is labeled a massacre because of violent loss of life as opposed to the loss of property, as in a riot. Number 1, massacre is a more fitting word than riot when concerning the Tulsa Race Massacre. That's what we have so far. I'll continue to let you know as more come in.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes.
I appreciate that. That's a brilliant response that you had read off first. It's really, really good. Okay, so of course, Opal's Greenwood Oasis. I am so excited for that to come out and just commend the professor for spending so much time and hard work on making that resource for educators. Again, the more resources we have, especially with younger students, the more comfortable I think we're going to feel. It isn't a topic that I think we can put off any longer. My oldest last year in pre-K was learning about the Oklahoma City bombing and learning about 9/11. Of course, in a very age-appropriate and sensitive way, she was still learning about it. And she was exposed to those things. And we must do that for our students for the Tulsa Race Massacre too. We cannot allow any longer for it to be adulthood before this is introduced and really dived into, and it's just so important. So I'm super thankful for that. And the other work that he had mentioned that's also coming out in February of next year is Unspeakable, the Tulsa Race Massacre. So I think with the addition of those things into our classroom libraries, I think that we're going to see a lot more done in our elementary grade levels too. Picture books truly are applicable up through upper elementary grades too, 5th and 6th grade. So many story elements, not to mention historical narratives, can be gained through picture books. So I don't want older grades to think that these are not useful to them too. These are really great ways to use mentor text for certain themes that we want to see brought up in our classes. And of course, the illustrations in both are going to be gorgeous too. Another resource, Up from the Ashes by Hannibal B. Johnson, is a great resource for younger grades too. I think many of us are familiar with Tulsa Burning, but for a long time was the one mentor text that we had for young adult novels, but it doesn't go as deep into the event as I think most educators had always hoped it would. I'm really excited though that we do have another resource. Dreamland Burning is a great blend of historical fiction and mystery. It alternates between two different narrators, one back in 1921 as the massacre is going on, and then one in present day. And I think this also is a really helpful resource for connecting the events of 1921 with injustices today. I think students are really going to be able to identify with that as well. And then a graphic novel that's available online. The creators of The Watchmen helped fund the creation of this graphic novel, and especially for students who reading's a little bit more intimidating for them, or they don't like to admit that they really love to read. Graphic novels are amazing, and they are books. And I think that showing students that type of resource too is huge. So this is something that I linked in the slides that you can click on this image and go to. It is not the same, what do I want to say, the same level of graphic nature as The Watchmen is. So I don't want anybody to be kind of concerned about that. This isn't a resource that, vet through, of course, like anything else, but is appropriate. And then for your older students, I don't know if we have any high school level teachers in our group today, but pulling up excerpts from The Burning from Tim Madigan would be huge too. I've linked some other ones at the end of my presentation to some other works of literature that I just think for adults to read and to learn from are huge, but that you could also pull from for your older students. The Burning creates really a full portrait of both Black and white citizens, and makes narratives out of information and interviews from survivors. And this, again, is a good resource to dig deep into those underlying causes: the jealousy of Black wealth, rumor, racism, how all those things can come together to fuel senseless violence. And also how silence and fear and embarrassment has really for decades resulted in just a huge segment of our population not knowing enough about this, and for us not making the restitution that we should have as a state, and how that's led to us not memorializing appropriately what has happened. So all of those things are just hopefully helpful resources that you, depending on your grade level, can kind of pick and pull from. I know it's a lot at once, and so I shared with Becca the shortened link to this presentation that has slides where you can go to certain resources with, and can also see the lesson plan too in more depth. And just connecting to the themes of place and movement that we have in geography in particular, to great digital resources that I wanted to make sure that I shared with you guys too are the African American Civil Rights Network, part of the National Park system, where they have collected and identified places that embody the narrative of the civil rights movement, places that have been important to that. And Reconciliation Park is considered part of this network. And then also the Civil Rights Trail includes other destinations during the time and the era of the civil rights movement that were important to that. So just both of those as resources with your students, and the lesson plan are included as extension activities, along with some other things to watch and to listen to with your students, but just places where you can make that connection of, again, circling back to the beginning of having students think of the significance of place, and places that are near and dear to them, and looking at movement and how this event displaced so many families, and what made some of them stay and rebuild Greenwood, and what others were prompted to move to different location because of what happened. So again, just some other resources for you, list of those literature pieces, and then hopefully some things that you can explore. The social studies framework that the committee I was on that completed earlier in the year includes a great analysis and great resources from social studies colleagues in our state that identified some ways that we can teach that standard. The Tulsa World Library has a great collection dedicated to this that I would encourage you to explore on your own time and with students as well. And of course, the commission has put together a lot of great resources too. So I will end that sharing and try to head back to where everybody else can see each other.
Thank you, Taylor. That was great. So we've got some time for questions. So if anyone has a question specifically for Taylor, please type it in the chat and we'll get to those. While you're thinking of questions, I've got one to start us off with. So Taylor, you mentioned that you've had experience teaching 9/11 and the OKC bombing. I wonder if you could talk a little more about breaching difficult topics in your classroom, if you've ever had a particularly volatile situation occur and how you handled it.
Well, the longer I've been teaching, the wiser I got about really setting the stage beforehand with students of what was going to be acceptable and what was not, and making sure that students knew that there was no place for insensitive comments or provocative comments that would derail us from the whole objective. So a technique, I guess you could say, or a strategy, particular with 9/11, because I have almost always taught in a very diverse setting, and I have students who are Muslim, and I never want that to be a setting where their faith is targeted because of those events. I've plainly put on my board like what our objective is, why we are learning about those events, and how that will remain our focus, and that we won't be derailed from that. But also spending some time, putting in a lot of time with my students beforehand. So maybe the day before, maybe start a few days before even that, depending on how well you know your students. Relationship's key here, of really laying the groundwork of what it means to respectfully discuss certain things with one another and how to do that appropriately. So it's always a good idea, even as a team building exercise towards the beginning of the year, to really have your students, I know we're not able to work in cooperative groups as we usually are, but most often in my table groups, or my families, as I would call them in my classes, do some activities with them well before any lesson like this, over what good, meaningful discussion should look like, and what the ground rules are for respectful dialogue, and how to even disagree about things in an appropriate way. So doing that with them, circling back and reminding them of those things and what our commitments are to one another as a family in that classroom really are, before we dive into topics, has always been helpful. I didn't start out doing that my first few years. I was just kind of getting my feet wet and realized afterwards how important that is, but those are things that I would highly recommend. With your younger students, there's probably not going to be so much opportunity for them to discuss things and have such, big, meaningful times of dialogue and discussion, but it's still really important to remind them that you are a classroom community that values one another, and that there will be nothing in that day's lesson that will deter you from that.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we had another question come in. We've still got some time for questions, so if anyone thinks of something else, feel free to type it in the chat. But here's one right here. Taylor, have you had experience with students discrediting your views or leadership as someone who does not appear to be a person of color? If so, how did you handle it?
I haven't personally experienced a student feeling that way, but I'm pretty upfront, and this is part of with my middle school students, that because we have that relationship established, and I am very upfront and I'm very acknowledging of how, as a white woman who is Southern Baptist and who kind of fits that mold here in Oklahoma, of course, that my experiences cannot pale in comparison. And for my students who are of different backgrounds, because we have that relationship established, I want them to feel comfortable sharing their experiences if they want to. They know that I'm not the ultimate authority on all of those things, but it's my job to present information and present facts, and just being sensitive and acknowledging of the biases that even I bring to the table. We all do. And if students are comfortable, giving them time to share their perspectives and share their feelings, and giving those voices more of a platform is super important. I know that in our state, we are not always in districts that are diverse, and we don't always have the privilege of hearing other voices. But that's also where I hope that we can begin to think of people we can reach out to, scholars, and those who are involved in different projects, like the professor, that we can amplify their voices, share their resources, and not be afraid as educators to reach out and see what others are willing to do to maybe Zoom in with our classes or give us guidance on how to do those things. I am obviously not the be all end all of how wisely to deal with those things, but if we are really transparent with our students, that goes a long way. They can see through it if we're not.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. So another question just popped up. Have you experienced any adamant opinions that are clearly rooted in parental guidance? If so, how do you dissuade these biases without provoking parents?
Yes, this is something I run into a lot. I do a media literacy and fake news unit with my students, and it's kind of grown over the years to include lots of different things. In fact, I this year have solicited my family and friends to save all their political ads for me so that I can take and snip from those things all the loaded language that is in those, taking out candidate names, of course, and just looking at how strongly those things are worded and for what purpose. So yes, parents are the biggest influence, of course, on our students' lives. And most of what I hear from them, especially when it comes to politics, is rooted in their parents' opinions and what they're hearing at home. So number one, reminding myself that that what they're sharing really is from what they're hearing at home, is important just for my own sanity, my own information, and then just responding back always calmly, that there are lots of different opinions about things, and I appreciate them sharing that with me. And if we're in an older classroom, I would love to maybe hear from someone else who has a different experience and a different perspective, and different worldviews is what they need exposure to, and lessons on how to interact appropriately and meaningfully with those who believe differently than them. I've never had, though, knock on wood, a parent complain about any of those lessons. And so I think just making sure, again, establishing those expectations beforehand of what appropriate dialogue is going to look like, and making it very, how do I want to word this? Making sure I include all types of different perspective and voices. And especially when it comes to the things I include in that fake news unit, that I give examples from lots of different groups and publications, so that it does not seem like I am singling out any one party or any one group. So even just discussing with students what bias is super important. That's not a term that they're super familiar with at all. So looking into that, and how admitting that I bring things to the table that affect my worldview kind of helps students to understand that about themselves too.
Those are great answers. Do you mind if I piggyback on what you said?
Of course.
So one of the things that I'll give you all a bit of ammunition. One of my favorite quotes is from Miss Clara Looper, Oklahoma's most noted civil rights leader. And in about 2016, Mrs. Looper said, "My biggest job now is helping white people understand that Black history is white history. We cannot separate the two." And I think that that's a brilliant, after that, it's like drop the mic, right? That's a drop the mic moment, right? The Tulsa massacre could not have occurred without Black folks amassing wealth in the midst of Jim Crow, and it would not have occurred without envious white folks burning it down and bombing it, right? So there's no way to separate our histories. Our histories are intertwined and have been since folks rolled over here, since before folks rolled over here on the Mayflower. So, but it's a part of our job, in my opinion. One of the most important aspects of our jobs is to help folks understand that intersectionality. That there's really no such thing as I mean, why is African American history still an elective, right? Why is it an elective? Why isn't it a required course? Well, we know the answer to that, right? But the real answer to that is, if we don't engage in helping our young people, because we can give it off on most of the older folks, right? But helping the young people understand that our stories are so intertwined that we coexist, that there's no way that we can function without one another in most ways. And when we attempt to do so, it usually turns out poorly. So that's one thing. And then I wanted to add something else about parental guidance. Yeah. So when I drove down to Bixby, Oklahoma, to work with the high school wind and brass ensemble for the 36 blocks composition, after a rehearsal, and this was the high school wind and brass ensemble, 80 young people, mostly I mean predominantly white folks and young white people in Bixby, Oklahoma. A young woman came up to the band director, and myself, and said that her father had concerns with the libretto that I wrote for the original composition. He had concerns that I not only called out the NRA, but compared the NRA in ways to the mobs of the massacre, right? That I compared the killings of Terrence Crutcher or Trayvon Martin to the massacre. And she was very nervous, very, very kind young woman, but she was very nervous to bring that up, but they were clearly her parents' opinions. And she was afraid that her parents would think if she participated in the performance, because they would be coming to hear it. And so the band director, thanked her for her, her thoughts and her comments. And he said, half of the European classical composers that we play in this ensemble were pedophiles, right? Like, so do you agree with folks being a pedophile? Well, no. Do you love the music? Well, yeah. So you don't have to agree with everything, but it is important for you to understand, right, the totality of the scenario, the situation which you're in, and think about it on your own and not under the influence of your parents' politics. And she left thinking about it, and she ended up playing in the performances. But it took that kind of, shaking of the rust of birth culture training from her brain or from her core for her to see differently. And ultimately, for all of us, that's what we're doing. That's our biggest job, right? So that's it. I'm done.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we've got just a couple more minutes. If anyone has any last minute questions for Taylor or Professor Lansana, we can take those right now. Otherwise, we will go into our break. So I'll give it just a couple minutes to see if another question pops up. So I was thinking of something, and I'm curious to get your thoughts, both Taylor and Professor Lansana. We were talking about the media literacy and misleading newspaper headlines. I wonder if you could talk about anything related to the Tulsa Massacre that you found particularly striking related to the media, either around the time that it was happening or in more recent history.
You want to go first, Taylor?
Go for it.
Okay. Absolutely. I mean, first of all, prior to the massacre, the Tulsa Tribune was fanning the flames of racial inequality. Again, remembering as Taylor referenced earlier, this city, Tulsa, Oklahoma, as well as the state of Oklahoma, was established and run by the Klan, and hell, may still be run by the Klan. But certainly we know, it's historically documented, that it was the state and certainly Tulsa was established and run by the Klan for decades. And so that meant that men and women who were largely men who practice and preach racist ideologies were responsible for laws, for governance, and for the newspapers, for the media. And so the Tribune fanned the flames of racist hatred in all sorts of ways, even prior to the massacre. And just in the language and in the inflammatory and derogatory language in which Black folks were referred in that paper, it was just as awful. And so also then thinking about there are cartoons in the Tribune. There are a lot of editorial cartoons. Randy Crabill's book really highlights, and also Brophy's book really highlights some of those editorial cartoons from the Tribune that are pretty horrible things about demands for racial or economic justice. So there'd be plenty to mine regarding that. And then you could also look at through a different lens, what A.J. Smitherman in the Tulsa Star, what he was publishing, including his own poems, which Taylor shared, in his op-ed pieces, and his calls and demands for justice and for equal rights, as well as Roscoe Dungee's from the Black Dispatch in Oklahoma City. But there's really very little removed from what the Tribune, the kind of bile the Tribune was spinning about Black folks, and some of the bile that we experience today from OAN. Every now and again, Fox goes there. There are plenty of other entities to the right out there that are perpetuating things like, BLM wants to defund the police, and that pigs in a blanket comment and stuff, which are completely not true. So yeah, I don't know that it's very far removed from then to now.
Yeah, sadly, I think that there are many connections that older students can draw from that, especially if, the TV at their house is always running on one certain news channel versus another. If I can, I'm going to share my screen really quickly just to show let me do that. Okay, there we go. If one of the links I included was from the Tulsa World, and even they have been pretty vocal lately about the way that it was reported then versus what we know to be true now. Just having students even look at these front pages, such as race war. Well, it wasn't an equal battle that both sides were ready for. Outbreak at courthouse, troops and armed men patrolling the streets. Just looking at the verbiage of those things and having your students examine those misleading things, and maybe how it would be more appropriately addressed, maybe having them fix those things. Again, race war, just all of these different ways to address what happened. The fact that, okay, the largest headline in this is 2 whites dead in race riot. How we see the word rioting come up over and over. All of those things, and dead estimated at 100. Well, having your students discuss who among the dead are they really counting in that number? It's not what we believe that number to be now, of course. Refugees guarded in camp at county fairgrounds. Should be more citizens forcibly interred. Things that the way that we phrase them is so important. And making that connection to today. I think
even that headline, Taylor, that read "Negroes gladly accept guards."
Yes,
right?
Thank you. Welcoming the help. Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much. Yes.
All right. Thank you again, Taylor and Professor Lansana, for your perspective. We're going to take a break and then we'll go into the final presentation. Let's meet back at 6:45. So we'll do a 10-minute break and we'll meet back at 6:45. So if you're just now joined, all you need to do for the break is just turn off your video and mute yourself and then come back when you're ready.